Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight and joining us in celebrating the opening of Hito Steyerl, This is the Future. The AGO is proud to present this comprehensive survey of the artist's work from the last 15 years. It is the largest time-based media exhibition we have attempted to date, and the result of many months of preparation and hard work from our extremely talented team. So a big thank you to every one of them, particularly the project manager, Christine Rolanti, and the curatorial research assistant, Katarina Veljovic. I would also like to bring your attention to our special guest this evening, the members of the Milky Way Garden from Parkdale. They're right over there. For those of you who have seen the exhibition already, you know that they've been Hito's collaborators for the last year, and the result of that process is on display upstairs as part of the work Free Plots. It has been an immense honor and pleasure to work with Hito in preparing this exhibition, and I would like to thank her for her generosity with which she has engaged in that process. She has given us a wonderful exhibition that I hope you will return to see many more times for the next 4 months. To experience the world filtered through Hito Steyerl's precise yet dispersive lens is to enter a parallel universe where familiar concepts acquire new dimensions and meanings, and where our current reality is presented in kaleidoscopic refractions. Every work starts from an image, a character, a concept, or a location, onto which she juxtaposes various visual, narrative, and sonic layers. Equal parts humorous and frightening, Steyerl's vision of our world is often accompanied by an irresistibly danceable soundtrack. Her work encompasses film, visual art, writing, and critical thought. Her practice resists simple definition. Any attempt to define what she does would require a completely new language, one based on the investigative methodologies she uses to illuminate complex networks of associations and collaborations. To discuss her work, Hito will be joined this evening by Brian Droitcour, writer and editor of Art in America, as well as a contributor to the exhibition catalog. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Hito Steyerl and Brian Droitcour.
Thanks, Adelina, for the introduction and for including me. It feels really good to be part of such a great exhibition. Hito, you have a reputation in the art world as a kind of prophet of the digital age and a keen observer of how media circulates and how structures of international capital and networks are changing our lives. But I feel like this often obscures your work as an activist and an organizer. And that's been coming to the foreground in a lot of your works lately. It's a bit harder to display in a gallery setting, but you have been making works with or about community organizations. When I last saw you this summer, you were opening your show Drill at the Park Avenue Armory in New York, which included a new video that included interviews with anti-gun activists in the United States. And here in Toronto, you're showing Broken Windows, which was made in New Jersey and is about a group that paints over boarded up windows in order to sort of protect the neighborhood from police surveillance. And so I was kind of interested in how you came to this shift in your practice from making works that were so much about things like drones and 3D models and financial networks, and we're coming to really focus on people and community organizations.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brian, for your extensive question. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks a lot, Adelina, and Stefan for the introduction. So, yes, to come to your question, I think those strands have always coexisted in my work. No, there always has been a very documentary, maybe core to it, but then also a more playful, maybe even more wacky, fictional, partly essayistic strand to it. So both have coexisted. And usually the documentary work was sort of pushed into the background very often. But I think that, of course, also since 2016, if we want to talk about that as a precise date, I think basically the last hopes, if they were existing, about the digital space being very empowering and liberating and also a space for creativity, have been very much disappointed, right? So the atmosphere, especially in the digital sphere, has changed a lot, right? And so it is, I didn't stop, making works about technology, also about, I don't know, artificial intelligence and so on, and I still do it, but I think there is a sort of sobriety that's crept into that work as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that installation here, the work about the organization in New Jersey is paired with another video that's about people who are developing an artificial intelligence system that will identify the sound of broken windows to create alerts. How did you come to pair those two? I mean, I feel like juxtaposition and the cut, that kind of pairing of unlikely couples is such an important aspect of your work.
Yes, I was utterly fascinated when I first read about those researchers in Cambridge who were literally breaking hundreds of windows, regular windows of houses in order to train an artificial intelligence to recognize the sound of broken windows so that the system could probably call the police or something. But, in order to train the system to prevent, the breaking of windows, ultimately, they had to break all these windows, and this was their job. And they did it, all day long. They broke windows. I thought that was fascinating. Also, the sound aspect to it is very often sort of not really acknowledged in technology. It's a lot about images, image recognition, automation, and so on, but not a lot about sound. And that's a whole, new field for recognition, for example. But just the idea that you had to basically break a lot of things to create some kind of cutting-edge technological process that became for me a sort of symbol of what is called creative destruction, ultimately, as an economical model, but also as an urban model, as something that really starts to impact on cities and to destroy or to hollow out or to, I don't like that word, I didn't know the word at all. The word blight was new to me, and I was taught to avoid it, right? But to destroy parts of cities is one of the side effects of technology.
And how do you see that relationship between creation and destruction in that Camden association? Do you see a kind of parallel there or sort of an inversion?
So basically the connection between both is the different relation to windows, right? One group destroys the windows to make progress, and the other sort of symbolically, in a way, repairs windows by painting them. So they paint basically decal windows in order to install in front of broken windows to make the neighborhood look differently. And I was thinking through this very ambivalent and interesting process of repair, and that a window needs to be painted in order to be repaired. I thought it was fascinating. So I tried to juxtapose both of these processes to try to think about cities, What does technology do in urban space? But also, what is painting, Yeah.
I think it's a really beautiful example of people making art together in order to protect each other and their communities. Another area of your activism that you've been working in for a long time is sort of trying to support the Kurdish people's fight for self-determination. You have organized auctions to support the People's Protection Forces and worked with the Rojava Film Collective. And this goes back to a long time. I know that the film November here that is being shown here from 2004 is sort of about your friend Andrea Wolf, who fought with the People's Protection Forces. Could you talk more about how that that came about and your work in that area?
Yes, so this area of the world was nothing I was looking for, right? I didn't look for it, it came looking for me. It crashed into my life suddenly when I received the news in 1998 that my childhood friend Andrea Wolf had been killed somewhere in Turkey, in the mountains, in an unknown location, apparently in a sort of military fight. And we heard some rumors that she had been extrajudicially executed, and that was basically all we knew for many years. In a couple years later, I started making an essay film about what I remembered, from her, and tried to juxtapose it to this kind of, let's say, her role as a political martyr in the Kurdish movement, whereas I and her, we had been making Super 8 Marshall film movies when we were 17. So I tried to think through the unlikely juxtaposition of these very, very different types of imagery. And I started thinking about the role, this is in 2004, right? This sounds very trivial now, of traveling images and how technology, and at that time, literally there was not even YouTube. The images that were transported were basically given from hand to hand on VHS tapes. So that was November, a sort of reflection on the role of the political hero and the martyr. And actually, a couple years later, around 2012 or 2011, the site of this alleged massacre became known because there was a peace process in Turkey at that time. And a lot of the mass graves that happened to be excavated during the long period of the unacknowledged civil war were suddenly becoming public. It's not like they were being discovered because people always knew where they were, but they just couldn't talk about it. So suddenly there was the news that that the location where my friend was supposed to have been killed had become known. And we went there. It wasn't the easiest trip, but it was very memorable, and we ended up coming to some sort of small battlefield in the mountains where clearly a military conflict had taken place. There were hundreds and thousands of ammunition cases and rocket shells and debris and also human bones interspersed within this whole mess. And this was the site which had been somewhat cleaned up in the interim, but it was still a battlefield. And I had to digest this experience for quite a while, but then I started basically tracing the trajectory of the weaponry of this debris I found on the battlefield, just to try to figure out where it would lead me, and it was no surprise that it would lead me back to the metropolis where I lived, and was basically a part of my daily environment, going as far as discovering that, you know, many of the art spaces I was exhibiting in had basically links to the military armament companies that were involved in this massacre. But at that point, something else also happened because, you know, I went to this site and I had a very, in a way, I had an expectation that I would go and basically pick up the bones and try to reassemble the person I had known. And then I went there and I realized it didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense, right? Because, you know, there were 40 people all mixed into one another. So basically, the only chance I had of trying to even to comprehend this was to decide that all of them were my friends now. You know, there was no reason to try to separate them. It's just all of them. And since then, I have been going back to the region, you know, and have done many other works and have tried to follow the development of what transpired in the next few years, which was momentous, you know, mainly with the Syrian war, of course, with the carving out of sort of semi-independent territory in northern Syria, with the invasion of Daesh or Islamic State into that territory and also into northern Iraq, and so on and so on. So there were many, many different stages of these events transpiring. And actually, just a couple weeks ago, I was planning to go back to northern Syria, which is the area which is now under invasion. And I had a plan. I still have that plan, actually, and I did apply to travel to that location, and it was about something I had read in the Washington Post. It was about art therapy. What was it about? Apparently, some Kurdish psychologists ran art therapy in some of the prisoners' camp for the Islamic State. What was the reason? They said, you know, we can't keep them. We have to release them after a while. There's just too many, and also if we keep them, they are going to feel resentful, and then this whole cycle of violence will be repeated. So the best we can do is to give them some art therapy and hope for the best and hope for reconciliation, and then we have to let them go. And I was super fascinated because I told myself, well, if this really works, and I assumed it was working, I mean, just optimistically, no? I hoped it would work. Then I thought these guys have found something like the philosopher's stone of art, right? It's like the Holy Grail. It's like the thing we all really need to know. And not only to re-educate someone somewhere, but, you know, in Germany, there is so many people, you know, who need to convince using art therapy or whatever else, you know, to let go of this cycle of resentment and hatred and so on and so on. So I really went there to try to talk to someone to find some kind of manual, you know, of how to do it, how to use art to basically achieve this kind of transformation. And then the invasion happened.
And then what happened? Oh, the invasion.
Yeah.
So you didn't learn what the course of therapy was?
Oh, believe me, I will find out. Invasion or not. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And are you in touch now with the people you worked with in Rojava? And
most of them have evacuated at this point. But so I think most of them have left the country at this point.
So the Parkdale Gardeners are here in the audience tonight.
Yes.
And this is an iteration of a project that you began in Berlin and then did in New York. I was wondering about how you came to gardening as a way of interacting with people and producing art. Have you gardened yourself at home in Berlin, or?
I think, I need to be respectful enough to plants to try to avoid coming too close to them. If plants had feet, they would run away from me. But I love plants, but they don't love me, unfortunately.
But you're good at finding people who are loved by plants.
Yes, so basically I'm really dependent on people who are loved by plants, and I love working with people who are loved by plants and love plants. Yes.
And who did you work with in Berlin when you first realized this project? Or maybe you could also, it's called free plots, right? And
yes.
the planters are shaped like free ports in Panama and Geneva. Mm-hmm. How did you come to that idea of putting gardens in free ports?
Yes, so I was suddenly exposed to the reality of tax-free zones or of free ports, because an artwork by me was sold to a collector, and I realized it had ended up in a free port. I saw that on an invoice and I said, whoa, this is real. This really happens. I was very naive. I didn't really believe this would be the case, but it was. So I thought, okay, so now what can I do? And so I just started some kind of inquiry or experiment, which in a way is still ongoing. It is an experiment. So my idea was that, the free port is, of course, a sort of extraterritorial territory for the purpose of tax dodge and also, reduced liability, jurisdiction, whatnot. Keller Easterling wrote a very beautiful book about these kind of zones called extra statecraft. And I was thinking, can I think about, a similar kind of territory which is in a way non-traditional, which is mobile, which is not under, traditional jurisdiction, but which is in a way the contrary, of what a free port is. Is there a way to think about a territory which is co-produced, which is mobile, which can travel, and which still inspires different kinds of communities congregating around it? So the first step was to travel and meet a horse that was living close to Berlin, who was the first co-producer of this community, and we acquired about 2 tons of the manure of the horse and started composting it, and then donated it to a community garden close to where I live in Berlin. And then we made the first experiment with planters. They chose to grow plants which reminded them of the areas in Panama, for example. They grew beans. They used the planters for educational purposes. And then my idea was basically to take along these planters through different locations and to repeat the same experiment over and over again with the help of different community gardens. And at first I thought they would contribute the plants, and we would, have an exchange about the conditions of the community garden and so on and so on. I didn't really realize it would go beyond that. But in the first iteration, I realized that basically the stories that came along with the growing were also part of the garden, right? They were also growing. It was not only about growing plants, but also about growing community and growing stories. So I started to record some of those stories and to basically play them from the planters. And it's an ongoing project, and it's very much also an open inquiry. For example, one of the things I noticed in all 3 locations is that all 3 of them are in locations which are under massive pressure because of gentrification. So that's one thing that all 3 locations have in common. So I'm trying to derive principles from from comparing these situations, which are very similar because they are in all cases caused by similar conditions, exploding real estate cost, then platform capitalism, Airbnb, but also massive influx of people into cities, also creative class and so on. So I hope that also, in the back of my mind, even though this is not the surface of the project, this will also hope to establish, some sort of catalog, not only of the difference of the locations, but also their similarities.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that this project does something similar to what your videos do in that it finds very local or personal stories and shows how they're connected to international flows and phenomena that are happening in all over the world because of the way capital is connected globally. And it also kind of makes me think of this sort of like international aspect to your work, even as you are working more with communities. Makes me think of this remembrance you wrote for Okwi and Weezer, the curator who died earlier this year, where you talk about his vision for an art world that is kind of a model for a progressive internationalism. Do you think that is still possible in art?
Well, I would certainly hope so. No? I think right now it's becoming probably more difficult. Yes, at the moment it's really becoming more difficult, but there is also a chance in this difficulty. I think that definitely a model of the art world which we have known until 2016, that was characterized by biennials and lots of events and lots of, fossil fuel travel around the world and a specialization on, a traveling class of people that would be called the art world that would, jet around the globe. All of that is not longer going to be sustainable. And that was also the infrastructure, for also many positive things that Okwi would have called progressive internationalism that sort of managed to exist in some kind of niches of these activities. But I think that's no longer sustainable, and I think this progressive internationalism that Okwi called for has to be realized differently in what I would call something like a new vernacular, right? Something that is very, very situated in a concrete place, and yet this concrete place, basically in most cities, they are extremely diverse, and basically all the internationalism one could be looking for is usually already available on site, right? And I think that this is basically the constituency that, an art world could develop as progressive internationalism from here on.
You mean by interacting with communities of
discovering your neighbors,
Yeah.
literally. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
just looking around, hello.
I'm also thinking about, you've been in touch with Citizen Lab, which is a research group in Toronto that is working on human rights and kind of cyber warfare or surveillance, and does a lot of work in different places around the globe that are dealing with similar problems, whether it is armies of Twitter bots or spyware. Do you think what they do provides a model for how you're interested in working, or how you think artists could work?
Yes, definitely I wouldn't be able to work like that because I'm lacking, of course, the talent and the abilities to do the kind of engineering-based and very technologically specialized work they do. But I think it's fundamentally important now. So just to explain, the Citizens Lab is a research center affiliated to a part of Toronto University that does research into basically human rights abuses, but also corporate abuses or censorship using digital technology and the internet. This goes from, investigating clusters of fake news to, Twitter bot deployment, the influencing public opinion in authoritarian states, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, it's truly staggeringly fascinating. I'm a complete fan. For me, it's like superhero. But this is very important because usually, right now, the ability to even understand, let alone deploy this kind of technology, is mainly in the hands of states and corporations. So having public institutions who are at least able to understand what is going on and to point it out, this is extremely important right now.
So the kind of limitations of the current system of the art world came up, and you mentioned how the research you did after the death of your friend uncovered connections between art institutions and the military-industrial complex, and that was in 15 years ago, but now this is sort of all over the art news, whether it's Warren Kanders leaving the board of the Whitney, or Jana Peel leaving her post at the Serpentine because people protested their connections to arms dealers. And the conversation that I find really interesting among artists now is thinking about a kind of new direction for institutional critique, which is not simply describing and pointing to the problems with existing systems, but what's sometimes called building as critique. It's about making new spaces and fledgling institutions that provide things that are not present in the art world now, whether that is equitable relationships among coworkers, or providing adequate funding to artists, and providing kind of access and care that institutions don't usually do. Is this something that you kind of see yourself doing in some of your more socially oriented projects, or you're organizing? Is this something that you are following?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's two aspects to it. One is to start to build something new besides the existing art world, and I think this is absolutely important. It just takes a lot of time and also takes a lot of resources. And I see it happening a lot in rural spaces, or in spaces which have been depopulated and where people are moving back in. And that takes place also mainly not even in Western countries, even though it also starts happening there because of rent in the cities and whatnot. And these are locations where the notion of contemporary art has not been as rooted as of yet, and the conditions are given to start building something also without too many resources. So many new spaces are opening that deal with aspects of the rural, for example, and I'm very interested in that. That's one thing. The other thing is that I still think that existing art institutions are important, because they also safeguard, some kind of history and continuity. They are also a workplace for many people. That's also something that should not be neglected. It's not something, it is basically an institution, in my view, that mainly belongs to the public and to the artists, and, is there to safeguard the collection. And this is nothing that should be given up easily. It's also part of, ideally the common good and the public good, and it shouldn't be just abandoned like this. So I think it's really worth it, to try to claim those institutions also for the public good.
A few years ago, you had a conversation with Laura Poitras that was published in Art Forum, and there was a really interesting point of disagreement where she said that she thinks of selecting documents and organizations to work with as part of the research process, where you were saying that kind of act of selecting an organization to work with or a set of documents is an aesthetic choice. Mm-hmm. Do you still feel that way? Do you kind of think of the, finding groups to work with now is sort of the work that you're doing?
Can you specify?
Yeah, I mean, something like the group in Camden or the kind of activists you worked with in Drill, the work that was shown in New York. I mean, is that, or even like a gardening group, do you feel like that is where your work is focused now, kind of finding organizations and organizers to collaborate with?
Well, I think that's definitely one part of the work, no? It's not, the aesthetic aspect didn't simply vanish. I think still it's a very important part of the political articulation, no? And it doesn't just everything dissolve into realism. The how is still, for me, a very important concern, I mean, most of the stories I'm trying to tell are kinds of open-ended inquiries which also involve a lot of risk and vulnerability, because it's about me trying to figure out something, right? It's not that I know at the beginning what's going to be the result at the end, and it involves failure, it involves dead ends, it involves a lot of embarrassment, right? So it's like being naked on stage, sometimes like, oh my God, I should not have done this, but all of this happens, during the inquiry, and I still insist, on exposing the process of, inquiry or the seeking of information, truth, enlightenment, call it whatever you want it, and to keep that transparent and not to take it as a given, right? Very often now, especially because there is so many fake news, disinformation, relativism, and so on, people insist on getting the truth as a product. They want something ready, a fact, By the New York Times, it's in there, right? It's done. You don't have to know how it was made, if there was doubt involved, if there was a process. That's baby disappears behind the surface. But I still know that, that's not how it works. A fact is something that is also made, that involves a production process, along, of course, with trying to, interpret material artifacts or, pieces of evidence or impressions or images. So this is, one can call it aesthetic, one can maybe also call it to accept the reality of doubt.
In your earlier works especially, and maybe in your works up to 2016, you often will appear in the video, maybe just briefly, there, like I think in Lovely Andrea, there are scenes where you're directing the shots and sort of talking to the cinematographer you're working with, or in Liquidity Inc., you're sort of, you show your email correspondence with the institution that you're not meeting the deadline for. But in your more recent works, you are kind of, you're out of the frame. It is this process of research and documentary where you're working, I think, with bigger crews and with more people, more subjects. Has this shift been deliberate? Have you kind of been aware of it happening, or has it happened more organically?
Probably it is the case, but I didn't really notice. I didn't even feel that this was the case, since I still think that, the real portrait is basically the editing. This is the real portrait of myself. Or in Broken Windows, I think I'm the broken window, honestly. You know, if you want to see me, just look at the window being broken over and over again, right? So it's a bit displaced because ultimately also you cannot show yourself in every film. It's just so boring after a while, you know. I remember meeting Harun Farocki somewhere at an exhibition. He looks at me and said, you seem to own just one T-shirt. So it's like wearing the same T-shirt in every film, right? Yeah.
So that's when you stop putting yourself in your films.
Exactly.
I think that's all the questions I had. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to mention?
Oh, I would like to thank the gardeners so much. And also John and Stephen and Tish who are involved with the garden. No, thank you so much. It was such a lovely cooperation. No, thank you. Such a pleasure.